Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome back. We are reconvening now to begin our armchair discussion. So we're changing it up a little bit. And this afternoon we have an armchair discussion titled Social Protection Systems and Strategies, Highlights, Accomplishments from Member States. And this engagement comes on the heels of the TAC meeting, which was focused on peer engagement and knowledge sharing. So we're actually going to hear from some of our senior technocrats. We have all permanent secretaries up here, as well as our Director General. So I will turn it over to him because he's the moderator for this session, and I will also invite him to introduce our panelists for the armchair discussion this afternoon. So DG, over to you.
Yep, thank you very much, Minister. And as you heard, the theme of this discussion is on social protection systems and our strategies. And we're going to be focusing on the highlights and accomplishments of the different member states represented here. Each of the PSs and members of the technical group bring a unique perspective to this discussion because they have been actively engaged in some degree of innovation in respect of the solutions that they've brought for member states. And colleagues would recall that the purpose of this meeting is in fact for us to all present what we are doing differently or similarly, and to see how we can converge all of this into an OECS-wide system that takes the best examples from each member state and also addresses the nagging problems that continue to be faced by member states so that we can have a unique solution that responds to the needs of our people. We have as panelists Mr. Zilla Clark, St. Kitts and Nevis, Permanent Secretary Charmaine Hippolyte Emmanuel, St. Lucia, and Marissa Finch-Burke of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, so as Prime Minister Gonzalez says, the blessed land. So I will start by asking Azila of St. Kitts and Nevis to speak a bit on social protection policy and legislation and whatever innovations have been done in the Federation to that end.
Certainly. Thank you, DG and members. Coming out of a World Bank assessment in 2007-2008 that assessed all of the social protection programs that the Federation offered, World Bank and UNICEF, there was an assessment report completed that recommended, made key recommendations for the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. Key of those were consolidation of programs because scope, depth, and value were challenging for some programs, and called for the introduction of our first policy/strategy. With the assistance of UNICEF, the Federation created its first social protection strategy. And now with the assistance of UNICEF in 2024, we're now moving towards our policy. And so, as we are aware, social protection refers to all of the state's programs designed to address or target poverty and vulnerability. And the evolution from welfare, which some of our legislation still speak to the concept of social protection, is within the sphere that many of us exist now. And so for policies, our intention is to be aspirational, as well as being grounded to provide a clear foundation, for it to be rights-based, for it to be able to call upon, set a framework to address the silos that many of our ministries exist in. Social protection are traditionally within health, education, social services, but housing, ecclesiastical affairs, these things that go to the foundation of a person are key as well, but they're not all found under one minister, which we could understand, because some ministers' portfolios are quite expansive. Our policy will look to incorporating clear guidelines to reform and review, because one of the challenges in the region is that we do well with creating the policy, and we aim to implement the policy, but then for a myriad of reasons, natural disaster, political, economic shocks, we're not always in a position to review them. it also speaks to the capacity that is needed to do so. Our ministries are again moving from just the delivery of the services to examining data to create evidence-based programming that in and of itself requires a skill set and capacity that many of ours need to have mentioned in these overarching documents so that it can be the grounding to support the revisions of our organizational charts, etc. As it relates to legislation, I liken myself to Antigua and Barbuda because we both had a similar draft. We have a draft Social Protection Act. They have actually passed the act that confronts the question of organizational structures. Are social protection systems best placed under ministry or statutory entity? Our social protection systems, how do we deal with data protection and management? We all aspire to be able to gather information to make decisions, but the privacy, confidentiality, interoperability of our management information systems as we share amongst stakeholders, us and Social Security, us and health, those things have to be enshrined in legislation that protects the individual. We also have to do better on our public relations to the general public to know. Once your information enters into the sphere of social protection, it is accessible in non-identifying indicators or parameters for all of us to do our respective work. Because death for health reporting has a social impact for social, has an operational impact for education. The birth rates, reducing birth rates affects all of our parameters. And so once any of that information enters any sphere, the public needs to know that it is protected throughout as it evolves to help us to do our own. And of course, grievance and appeals policies. We are not a litigious region, but we know those that when they are fronted can find their ways to make their voices heard. And we need to be able to build a culture of process grievance, not Facebook grievances, not social media grievances, written grievances that go through a process that also has stipulations for responses. So there's challenges we have with organizational structures in our ministry where a person has a right to get a response within 7 to 10 business days, whether the PS is in office or not. And that requires a system throughout the structure that keeps those commitments to the general public. And again, our legislation should come with timeframes or indications for review. We're living in a very dynamic time. How we started 2024, June in and of itself changed that for many of us. And so our legislations must come with the parameters to be so updated regularly, whether it's in its entirety or with, in sections throughout. Thank you.
You're not off the hook yet because you've done a very good job describing what has been done in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis. But what I'd ask you now is, based on what you've described, having walked that road, what advice would you give, based on your experience, to other member states who are just beginning to formulate policy and legislation and would have to face challenges of implementation of that to practicalize it?
Yes, I think the approaches that the TAC is using for peer learning is key because a simple template or a guide for what we use here can be a great source of guidance or framework for other member states. We also call upon persons to build the relationships to speak about it because our geography, our people are more same than different. And so semantics might change within the document, but within that. I'm a nerd and a social worker by profession, so these things excite me, unfortunately. But I would encourage a permanent secretary to be excited about the opportunity to change the way we think and do social protection. It is not welfare. We view it that a person has a right to approach the state when they are functioning at a level that is below the national standard. We have an obligation to be able to provide what we started out with knowing as the safety net. But the safety net must be buoyant enough to absorb the individual and spring them out to another level. And sometimes keeping a view on all that is within social protection, again, because it's not all within your remit, can become a little distressing. But I think that enough dialogue is happening, and we're hearing that even in our joint ministers meeting, that it is through working collaborative that we all get to where it is. So whether it's the board or an interministerial committee, talking and sharing about that to be able to affect the operational structures will get us to where we want to be. But just remember, we've been welfare states much longer than we've been social protection technical deliverables or delivering states. So just rely on our international development partners. There's a lot of resource there and support within. But I think we can all get there just from learning, sharing, and engaging.
Okay. A couple of things I've picked up from what you said. One, this journey started by involving the World Bank. And I think one of the things that we often, or perhaps one of the mistakes we make, is to see the World Bank as just simply a bank. I've said to people that if you want to build a dam or you want to do some huge infrastructure project or anything, going to the World Bank is leveraging a huge resource of international knowledge and know-how, because they've done this all over the world. And so learning the lessons and so on, then the knowledge capacity of the bank, I think, is bigger than its financial impact. But that said, one of the things, my big takeaway from your intervention is something you just articulated en passant, and that is, you apologize for it, about your passion. But without passion in this work, the work goes nowhere, because it has to be a real grounding in, the passion has to be about wanting to see people move out of situations of distress and, discord and where they see no light, and to be able to help them see it, but to see it not in a way that fosters greater dependence and reliance on the state. So the more you give me, the more I want. But in fact, to see this as an opportunity, as a helping hand to make me take the first steps of the ladder upwards and preserve my dignity and make progress. So thanks for sharing. I want to turn now to Charmaine Hippolyte Emmanuel. Yeah, applause is right on. To talk about social protection graduation strategy. So in your case, Charmaine, I think you've walked some of the road beyond legislation. So what then is the strategy, the graduation to move beyond my last statement, having people in a situation where you're helping them in very impecunious situations to move beyond that?
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, DG. Like P.S. Clark, I come in with passion in terms of being a nurse midwife and a practicing social worker. So while some of the concepts may be brand new in terms of social protection, the areas of focus and so on is right up my alley. So I am really excited about what we do in St. Lucia. So looking at our graduation strategy, it is not only to save, quote unquote, some money as far as the state is concerned, but it is also to help persons or escort them out of services where persons have a tendency to become totally dependent on the state. So as per the mandate of our ministry, we want to focus on empowerment. We want to focus on total, independence, more or less. And we want persons to be able to do for themselves, do for their families. So with that sense of empowerment and confidence, I am sure they'll be better able to contribute. So when we look at the graduation strategy, really we do the pathway and also the approach of engaging our stakeholders, on the external end, but our social workers, our case workers, and so on. So with the graduation strategy, first and foremost, we do not do it on a way that seems subjective. We use the SLNet 3.0. Well, right now we're already speaking 3.1. Mr. St. Catherine. So we use that strategic scientific tool to actually find out where persons are at. The questionnaires will guide us to the scores that they will receive. And we have scores from 1 to 3. A 1 and 2, poor, indigent, and a 3 will indicate, I think it's more than 79. It will indicate that you are certainly not poor and you're not in need of the cash transfer. Now, again, depending on the questions asked, the responses given rather, you will get those scores. Now, earlier on, Sister Grenada made a very important note that I will take back. We actually introduce new pathways to persons, but she made the point of we should have introduced it prior so the excitement is built. I think it works either ways, but I like her approach. So we tell persons about the ways that they can go to become empowered as we prepare to escort them out of the system, some into entrepreneurship, some into education, some into business fields, and so on. And the graduation strategy winds down to either 3 to 6 months upon notice, and eventually they will be out of the system. Now, you would appreciate too that there is political and partisan backlash as far as that is concerned. As you heard this morning, as small island states, everyone knows everybody, and it's like, okay, if you get me off the program, I'm not going to vote for you. And this is where we as Caribbean member states have to ensure that those things don't merely depend on votes, but let's try to do what is right so that we empower persons and they get out of those dependent mode. Now, in terms of in terms of getting them off the service, while they're out, there is, of course, a waiting list longer than what we have, and we will, of course, have persons join in. Of course, even if persons will be willing, and so far some are willing to just opt to leaving or bowing out gracefully, there are some, of course, who will challenge. We do not want it to be a case of, okay, you see the PS or you see the DPS, and depending on how we feel for the day, we either really put you out or we take you back on. No, we actually developed an actual process, a scientific one, for the, we'll call it the redress mechanism. We have an independent body that will actually assess the cases. There are levels in this mechanism where persons will be heard, or someone could advocate on their behalf, and their cases will be seen individually or based on their situation. So this is what we're hoping to accomplish. We've actually started. Persons have been called. Some have opted to just bowing out. Others are asking for more time. And of course, others are like, I'm not leaving. This is my salary. You heard what I said, salary. And earlier on, we spoke of that feeling of entitlement. And if the payments are late, people will call and say, hey, I ain't get my salary yet. And eventually, people will understand because we're trying to teach, you know, what it is about and so on. And even en passant, I was speaking to DG and I mentioned to him, we do have a communication strategy which will be launched very soon, but would be grateful if the commission would just echo our voices so that it becomes a bit more authentic, hearing from the commission that we need to educate persons as to social protection activities and they being beneficiaries, not for a lifetime, but just to change or improve lives for that short period. Thank you.
Thanks, Charmaine. I don't know if you all notice how interesting it is that their careers and their passions intersect with the work that they're doing now. Because what I took from Charmaine, she's just spoken about social protection as a form of midwifery, you know, to facilitate the delivery of empowered futures. No, this is serious. I'm serious. The delivery of empowered futures. And there's a big conceptual difference between seeing social protection as something that you continuously have to give people to help them survive versus seeing it as a midwifery operation where you have to deliver for independence and independence in life. So I want to ask you, what are the big challenges of graduation? You've spoken about the experiences, but what are the big challenges? What are the push factors, as in the things that propel people to graduate versus the pull, which are the retardation factors that keep them wanting more?
Okay, so the keep them wanting more part, although some of them are actually actively employed, they want to remain on the program. And some would say, well, the St. Lucians or Dominicans would understand, they will say, est-ce que je m'attendais l'argent gourmet? In other words, the more I have, it's okay. But then they don't understand that other persons are in need as well. So they will go through the lengths and they'll be like, I know the prime minister, I know the minister, and I know where to go. And we try to educate them as much as possible. Thankfully, Minister Henry and Honorable Pierre, they understand the whole thrust into graduating persons. So far, I have not noticed they calling to say, put this person back. And I think one of our members mentioned that this morning, that whole idea of having to put persons back will really have a negative impact on us. I'm not experiencing it just yet. So on the flip side of the coin, we will have persons who are, some of them are just not able to grasp the concept of wanting to learn or wanting to move into something else to become independent. So we've spent a little time there trying to help them understand and get into what we would like them to, so that we escort them gracefully out of the program. Of course, I am extremely sensitive to the partisan/political backlash. And you will hear persons screaming on top of the floor, if you all move me, Labour Party down, I'm not voting anymore. You know, that kind of a thing. So you do not want to be a set of workers who will be responsible for the Labour Party going down in the event that actually happens. So you have to weigh now, will the Labour Party really lose the election if some people are off? Pardon? Okay, the government of the day. Will they really lost the election if you get them out? So we take these people in and we have the conversations, and you kind of get the aha moment from them. But some, no matter what, do not move me, I'm not going, and I know where to go for you. So of course, as the days roll, we have to balance between having to give in, but we really stick to the processes of the redress mechanism. Hopefully we will get it up and running so that persons will feel that they actually got a hearing, one that is structured and well organized.
Mm-hmm. So having explained in a condensed way the push and pull factors, can you make it more real by giving, from your experience, just two real life examples of somebody who has graduated, and how did that feel for them? How did they express it? How did that graduation process help them? Versus somebody who you see as continuing the perpetuation of dependence.
Okay, those who opt to just say, okay, no problem, they had been employed and they never reported. So we were happy that it was easy to say, hi, this is so and so and whatever. Like, oh, sure. Okay, sure, no problem. So we found out, like, okay, why was that so easy? Because we expect a fight no matter what. So they said, well, truth be told, I've been working for the past year and I'm doing very well. And we were like, did you say the past year? Yes, I work at so-and-so hotel, or I have this business. And we were like, okay. And they just left. But the others who really do not want to leave, and some may not even want to work. I am not leaving, and they come to the office, so the caseworkers have to take them privately and all of that. But even this morning when we spoke of legislation, what I would really want to focus on, hopefully, is to give us that kind of power to, well, power may be too strong. We do not want persons to save the money, DG. And persons save. I'm not talking about $10,000 here. We're speaking $250 plus EC dollars. Okay? Less than a year ago, 1,000. Less than a year ago, a gentleman passed, and there was this commotion in his family. Of course, when they passed, from the public assistance, we offer a voucher of $1,500 to give the lowest package for burial. Back in the days, PS Clark, they call it the paupers package. So we have canceled that language and we call it just a burial grant. And when the gentleman, they came to receive it and someone said, why y'all giving these people that grant? They don't need it. I'm like, no, no, no. This is one of our clients. And we got to know there was $250,000 that the siblings started fighting over. It really pained me. For one, it's like, oh my goodness, nobody picked that up. And secondly, how do you decide? Yes, they were on PAP, but can you deprive them now that they are gone? And we have another case from a financial institution where one of the workers said to me, I know it's not my place, but it bleeds my heart when I hear you guys begging for persons to come off, and so has so much money, so much so when you all are late, they come to say, hey, my salary is there yet? And she has thousands of dollars. So in essence, if you can save so much, it means you do not need the assistance. Now, we have not had that conversation. Maybe you could guide me, DG, in terms of how do you get into these people and how do we actually let them know that we know so that we cease that kind of operation?
Send the police for them. No, but really, it's unconscionable because it means people who do that are depriving persons who really need it from getting it. But what the first part of my question was more about somebody who, the people you say who, when you call them, they say, oh yeah, that's fine because I have another job, truth be told. I want you to think of an example of somebody who used the program in the way it was intended to be. So without necessarily you asking them, have you had an experience of somebody deciding voluntarily, well, thank you, I got the help, this is what I've done, this is what I've achieved, and I'm grateful for the leg up.
Okay, there was one case,
and how did it make such a difference?
Though informal, in speaking to that individual, she was like, okay, I'm happy I was on the program, but then I think you need to know too that there are people on the program who should not be on it. And in my mind, I'm like, yeah, you had it for a year, you were working. So maybe they're understanding, but we've not had that publicity of persons actually saying, or we have not asked them to, they're actually saying that, yes, I was on the program, I'm out now, and this is what it has done. Maybe at the end, by April thereabout, we will actually have that kind of commentary.
So you've had no examples of somebody coming to you and say, I'm grateful for what I've gotten, but so far I'm good?
No.
Okay.
Not yet. Not as yet, because the reviews are still going on.
How long has the program
still making
been? How long has the program
the reviews?
The assistance program.
I don't understand.
How long has the assistance program been running?
You mean graduation?
Yeah.
Oh, we just started.
Okay.
We just started.
And prior to the graduation thing, you just
prior
remained on?
to that, in fact, I joined, it's exactly close to a year. Prior to that, we had recertification and so on to ensure that persons are actually eligible. And this is where the whole concept of the scoring came on. So those, of course, with the threes are now being called. Okay, as I came in, this has just started. So we have not actually gotten the totals and find persons coming in to say, well, I am grateful or I am better off and so on. Yeah.
Because in our discussions this morning, we were saying that one thing that could probably be used is some messaging testimonials of persons who have made it and who are grateful for the assistance, who can tell their story of how they've used this as a step up to where they want to go. And maybe that might morally encourage other people to see it in that light rather than seeing it as a way of scamming government or just remaining perpetually in a situation of dependence.
Yes, I think we'll look forward to that, having persons come and help us, and that will be a plus for our communication as well. Yes.
But what would make it a plus for them is if they get a lot of publicity about it so people can look at them with pride and, they can feel elevated in the public light.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, DG.
So we come to you, Marisa, to talk about shock responsive social protection expansion vertically and horizontally in the face of natural disasters. So having been through the devastation of part of the blessed land, how does that work for you there?
Thank you, DG. Good afternoon, everyone. So, St. Vincent and the Grenadines have had two major national disasters over the past 3 years, with a lot of in-betweens of the pandemic and additional hurricanes and tropical storms at Category 1 levels. So the major ones that would have displaced maximum 20,000 people at a time would have been the volcanic eruption of 2021 and the most recent, the Hurricane Beryl. And what must be set here, DG, is the context in terms of how do we get to shock responsive social protection, because it's not something you take out of a hat. You must start with a platform of what is social protection for your own space before you start looking at adaptive social protection. So for us, what social protection is, we have to talk about the legislation, and our dear P.S. Clark gave some context. We also have to talk about the programs that will help to build people's lives or empower them, which is what our dear P.S. Hippolyte spoke on. But what we have to add to it is the institutional strengthening that is required. It is also the social and behavioral change components out of it and the communication that DG just asked about. And for us, we first started as well with over 10 years of research by building out our social assistance management information system. So here we are at this point. We delivered on it in the learning event that was held in March, where we basically, it's a build out from the SLNet, where we are looking at profiling basically households. You are looking at their demographic and socioeconomic context and profile. You are also adding the psychosocial interventions and the type of support and variables that are necessary to understand people. Now, in a perfect world, if all households are identified or profiled that way, then when a shock comes, it's quite easy to do your vulnerability mapping based on that. We are not there yet, we are about to be. But the important thing is we start with that institutional capacity building or strengthening support, which is based on having the appropriate system. Earlier today, DGU spoke of when we were having that exchange in the room in the meeting today, is that how do you have the integration or systems speaking to each other rather than just having independent systems? We are talking right now, we are having discussions right now with the education sector with regards to their EMIS, which is the Education Management Information System, and how do you do student user IDs, matching it back with parent unique identifiers, and then matching it back to our social management information system. Because that way, whatever information is provided at registration with a child and carrying them throughout their school tenure can then be matched to the very same school-based or supportive interventions for children in social assistance management systems. So those are things that you can do through MOUs. I know Azila talked about the legislation and data sharing, but there are other alternatives for implementation, because what you don't want is a policy just wasting away on a shelf and not having the implementing power. So we started with MOUs. So P.S. Hippolyte talked about burial grant as an example. But we have MOUs with the National Insurance Services, so that, and other friendly societies and credit unions and so on, so that when it's time to do the checks, you can be able to tap into their system so that we can get a response to know who can benefit or who is eligible. So all those are things that are critical before we start talking about shocks. How do we now upscale vertically and horizontally to address actioning activities to support people during a shock? Now we are there based on the the right standard operating procedure, the right system to be used. We have the appropriate programs. How do we now scale up? Where we started is that we restructured in 2020 in light of COVID-19 to then transition from universal or just targeted programs based on certain prehistoric needs, so then looking at more broad-based family support grant type programs with the ability to have the upscaling due to different types of shocks. So like, for instance, there are internal shocks that are pertaining to the movement of people when people have to be resettled because of different things. A good one, we had the CDB loan for the port modernization project, and that was a shock because it meant that some people have to be relocated. They were informal settlers. How do we now bring them to an improved standard of living? So that's a type of shock, right? So it means that we had to then scale up our family support grant because that is the grant that would lead people to graduation, right? So we're using that grant rather than focusing on our other emergency grants and vulnerability grants. We look at a grant called our family support grant that now has the capacity to have different layers for different types of shocks. So one such type is for resettlement. When people are already financially vulnerable, they are informal settlers, or they are moved in the public interest. So then we have to then prepare different type of resettlement packages so that people can be able to move. That's one. We also modernize our payment structures or systems to accommodate the shock responsive social protection being manifested, looking at digital payments. So it means that if you are resettling, it's a shock, then we can place your payments through digital platforms instead. So that's also digital transformation. Our second type of shock as well, not really second yet, it is really another layer of resettlement. When you have to move small business owners and vendors, that's another one. In every Caribbean space right now, they try to do a lot of urbanization by revisiting where vendors sell or produce or manufacture. And you always know in your city areas or your urban areas, you have that constant struggle. So one good example is that the government was able to use this proposal from us with the structure that we have, where you are doing temporary income support, so that's a scale up. And during the temporary income support, you are able to provide compensation grants and benefits to small business owners or informal settlers or persons who are just squatting here and set up a tent and selling. And now you can be able to work with them with business training to basically improve their lives while having to move to a new location. So all that is still part of resettlement. So we go to disasters. Now, disasters in terms of providing the grant structure should then be matched against the types of disasters. That's critical. Whatever you use for volcanic eruption, you can't come back and use the same structure because it's a hurricane now, because there are different circumstances to consider. It's an entire different socioeconomic or impact profile. So then you have to ensure that the data being collected allows you to look at those different modalities. So number one, when we looked at the volcanic eruption, you were able to simply look at the same family support grant and scale up by way of family household size, because we have a base payment in the generic family support grant structure, but when it comes to a shock, there is a scale up. So the scale up would be based on vulnerabilities as a top up, and you have the additional payments because of the size of the household. So that is taken into consideration. So you have basically a vertical expansion, and you also have horizontal expansion brought in as well.
Now, in using that mechanism, it therefore means that we have the possibility right there of being able to cater to needs of the family and not needs of every person. Because then in a situation like that, we have transitioned in 2020 from individual targeting to household targeting. Now that comes with its own pros and cons, because then what defines a household? And you have households now where, based on the definition, they do not share the same expenses towards consumption. So then you have to then look at the definition to determine now how persons are placed and matched and who gets the card for the digital payments. Now people tend to start fighting and all these kind of things, right? But you have to be mediating along the journey, because you're realizing that we cannot promote family conflicts and we cannot enable people to start having, because I don't want to speak with you in the house, that I'm going to give everybody in the house a card. We're not Oprah Winfrey where we say, you get a car and you get a car, right? We're not like that. So at this point in time, we have to, it's a lot of, PSA Polly talked about that constant engagement, right? And it involves everybody. It involves our caseworkers, our social workers, even at our levels at the PS and the ministers, where you will have people coming with their grievances that we must be able to sing from the same song sheet. Right. The next one is hurricanes. Now with hurricanes, in the case of, you remember you have different grades of impact to consider. You have community level impact, you have regional level impact or district level or census level, and then you have national grade impact. When it's national grade impact, then you have to consider the scale of the operation in terms of the type of economic support that you can be able to offer. You can't know these things except you're collecting the data. You can't just be guessing, playing a guessing game, trying to understand, well, okay, we are accustomed giving this amount of money and this is going to be it. You also have to revisit the consumer price index, which determines the food basket, because then that determines now the cost, the minimum cost towards basic amenities that you can now add as a contributor to the proposal for how many people can get paid. What is the value that should be established? Whatever money we use as a recommendation for the volcanic eruption per household is not recommended now, it's actually more now, because 3 years has passed and we have to evaluate the food basket, right? Now, as opposed to then. So now with the hurricane, you have a higher value being established as the base payment. And then another thing to consider as small island developing states, when we are doing these types of proposals, because as I said, you're constantly doing social assessment and analysis to inform your new decisions. We must remember that we are starting from a place of grant from our own resources and from any other UN entity that may want to come along, thanks to persons, to organizations like WFP, UNICEF, etc. And you move to a place of loans. When you're moving to a place of loans, it's a different ball game. Because then if you're moving to a place of loans to help to supplement, because you have to also calculate the period of time it will take for recovery, which means you're moving from relief to recovery efforts. Your state and grant agencies can support in that short relief period, whether it's 3 months, etc. But then when you move into loans to help to supplement if you don't have it, so like for instance now, we were able to use from our disaster relief fund to be able to supplement, because and that formed the basis for our supplementary budget proposal that was done in time for the hurricane efforts. So you are able to use that to form part of the proposal for funding support for families. Then when you go into loans, you have to consider, okay, if we are designing the grant, we have to make sure that based on the precedent set, we can either continue with it under the loan, Or is it that based on the loan requirements, we may have to set the better precedent now under the grant so that there is consistency? So all those things have to be taken into consideration so that when you're moving to grant payments, remember we already modernized the payment mechanism. So we can use digital payments in relief, digital payments in recovery. So rather than you having to pay over the counter and you're going to find people where they are, you have to walk with security. Now, some things to consider. When people lose everything, you have to use alternative options to do verification. So a good example is, as much as we move to digital payments and as much as we move to SAMIS software, we didn't have electricity nationally for 10 days, right? And what do? There are different tools. There is Kobo tool. There is a lot of offline tools. Our software could do offline mode, those kind of things. You'll have to make sure take into consideration. Beside that, you have to look at your mechanism or your methodology for payments. Because then in Union Island and Myro in specific, where the ATM machines are totally demolished, right? And the time frame to import a portable ATM unit may be low or slow in coming. So what do? It means that as a short-term recommendation, like the first month of payment may have to be over the counter and then you transition. So these are things that must be thought out along the journey. So I want to stop there.
Thanks very much. I mean, you really could have kept going because, listening carefully to you, I think what's unique and special about St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and it may not be a scientific perspective, but it seems to me that you all have had the biggest record of successive natural disasters with the greatest variety. You've had volcanoes, you've had floods, you've had, everything has been thrown at you but the kitchen sink. And but what you've done with that is really distill those experiences and moving from starting with a vision, despite the ponderous nature of the challenges. Start with vision and then move to build institutional capacity, which then equals the ability to deliver with the sense of responsibility that you just described. And I'm pulling this out of the discussion because I think that would be helpful to the other member states, our sister member states, who are now looking at what type of system should we put in place. And so the lesson from that, we don't need, again, validation. We don't need an external consultant to tell us those things. We have 3 women here whose knowledge combined, if we combine the wisdom of these 3 ladies who spoke here this afternoon, can you imagine the quality and impact of the OECS system that we can build? So at this point, I want to open for any questions or comments from the audience that you may want to ask or to provide. Mike? Oh, since the audience is saying, you can use my mic. Sister, just take my mic.
15 more minutes. Okay, thank you all for your presentations, all very, very interesting. One of the things that I picked up on had to do with the systems that we're trying to set up, the MIS and the interoperability. And I know one of the challenges that we've come up against in Anguilla is, I think 1 or 2 of you spoke to it, has to do with the lack of legislation around data sharing. And one of the things you mentioned was the use of MOUs in place of legislation. I'm just wondering, do any of your countries, or any of the countries in the room, have data sharing legislation? And what, if anything, besides MOUs have been used to sort of get around this temporarily? I mean, we want to bring the legislation on, but we also don't want to stop what we're doing to get that to catch up. Because as you know, drafting legislation can take ages.
If I could share, Tasha Bharti, BVI, we do have a MOU with BVI Red Cross and the Social Development Department for, again, the data sharing mechanisms to support not just data sharing, but as well as the delivery of some of our social protection programming. And it has been working. Just recently signed, I think it was done in 2022, 2023, and it has been working for us. So we're free to share that as well.
I know for St. Kitts, with our new LIFT program, we actually have a MOU with our Social Security Board, because the situations that PS Hippolyte stated about people being employed, people under-reporting their earnings to be able to fit into the categories. So Social Security, being the clearinghouse for employment information, provides the verified earnings, and that is whose information we use. You can then appeal and do redress, but Social Security data is who. And then they've also assisted with the payment of our assistance to pensioners, because they do direct deposits to pensioners, and so we just add our LIFT benefit to that, and it's consolidated as one, with a small administrative fee which we pay for that provision. So those things are across building out. We have a data protection legislation. It does slimly speak to sharing parameters, but I think as we move to things such like the national ID system, I think that is key. One number that follows you from birth to death would be so easy to track persons. Those provisions are being put in place, and so it would call upon us to be able to, again, whether it's an amendment of the principal data protection legislation or in subsequent legislations, each speak to the parameters that are key but linked back to the parent legislation.
Okay, if I could just share my experience with MOUs, it's almost like depending on who is in the chair for the day, you following me, that it works. For example, when I led drug prevention, everybody would give in the information, maybe because I wouldn't stop until you give me, or my personality. But then somebody else comes in and it's either there's no reporting or under-reporting. So this is where we are now speaking of the SIS, Social Information System. And we will be tagging along with Ministry of Health. They already have an established ID, so that we are trying to tie in. And all in all, when we use that system, we are going to prevent a lot of double dipping. Because as we speak, it's like everything is all over the place. Someone comes to us for burial support. Then they go to what we call the SSDF. They get burial support. And they get so many grants and support for that one concern that they may have. So when the SIS kicks in, we will actually know. It's almost like my ministry will be the filter. You come to us and we know exactly where you will go. So the minute Cicero Simon comes up, we will know, okay, you've gotten this. So you can't get additional support from elsewhere. So yes, MOUs are good, but let's use them until we could actually have this system where everyone is well coordinated and connected.
Okay, thank you for excellent presentations. I had a question I didn't quite get the answer to. Persons, there are two categories. Persons who might have banking, for some reason, like an elderly person, who don't have a bank account. How do you handle somebody like that? And then persons who kind of live in remote areas, like in BVI, we have Enegada, it's really way out there, absolutely no banking on the island. How do you handle getting persons direct assistance like that, where cash to the bank is really, they can't get it. Even there's power, there's no access, because there's no banking on the island. It means going to Tortola to access a bank at some point in time.
Okay, so in our context in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we started this whole payment modernization as part of a loan with the World Bank, but then we waived that activity in favor of doing it supporting local. Because the bank was proposing something else, that you outsource through some payment company that is overseas somewhere, and then, you know, you are the local affiliate. But the cabinet would have waived in favor of using one of the local banks called Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we created an agreement with the bank where we pay the administrative fees. The bank sees the ministry as a client and not the beneficiary. So all cost is borne by the state, It's approximately $22,500 EC for the first year, and thereafter is $16,000 per annum, right, as administrative cost. So really and truly, when you weigh that against the cost, because we did a cost-benefit analysis, and when we recognize that you are paying out $22,500 for the first year, as opposed to in each year, you are paying basically $260,000 in your administrative costs just to operate, to pay every month, then it was easy to make a decision. So using that, we then negotiated with the payment company, which was the local bank. How can you increase coverage in rural districts? Because we are going to add to your fan base now. We are bringing 4,500 new beneficiaries, new households, who never banked before to now become
Financial
bankable.
inclusion.
So then naturally, they started setting up shop in other locations. So you had more ATMs going to different locations, and locations that never had them before. Then they started to also negotiate with other partners like credit unions. So then where a credit union is, so like for instance, we have one of the famous ones called GECU, which is a local credit union, so general workers. And that one, you can use both types of ATM cards at their ATM machine, which means the bank doesn't have to have a physical ATM there, right? So that then increased the basis. It just means that where it is not the bank and you are using one of our cards, then that's $1.50 every time you do that. So they moved from 14 ATM machines to 21 machines, right? And now we have one of our islands that doesn't have any on it, which is called Myro. But because of the hurricane that happened that basically did 93% destruction on their island, the Ministry of Finance through its minister was then negotiating now with the bank so that for the first time they can now get that. So those are ways in which we have been able to do that, but you must have a purchasing power or a negotiating power. But then you can't negotiate without the data, because you must be able to show that here's what. We have 4,500 new ones. They never plan to bring money to you. They never plan to invest with you. But here they are because of the government, who is wanting to use this program to do that. And it helped the bank as well, because we were pulling too much cash over the counter at a given point in time, which was a risk for them and it was a risk for us, right? And it was also a push from the ECCP to try to move more countries to the place where you are having digital cash transfers instead, right? So those were ways in which you can move from from not having enough access to improving access without the cost coming to you. If you notice, they were then compelled to do it because of our negotiating power. We had the trump card. We are bringing more investments to you. And those cards are reloadable ATM cards. It's not their personal savings cards, because the owner is the government. So it is that way we are able to transfer cash on it from anywhere. We have road cleaning projects, it goes on those cards. So you have road gangs where they clean the roads, the persons now, they get payments like that.
Quick follow-up. And it can't be issued beforehand as a preemptive thing? Thank you for that answer. Excellent answer. Was the cars, are they preemptive or they only come after the disaster? For example, in the case of Enegada, is there a possibility maybe you can issue the cars empty beforehand, and if you happen to need the cars, then you fill them?
Remember when I started the discussion, I did say, in an ideal world, we want everybody registered. If all households are registered, in an ideal world, you can match a household to a card. Right. So had we had that, we couldn't do that. We didn't have all the resource. Right. So you have to do it after somebody is identified as having that need. But when we get to the point of every household being registered, just like you would when, you're doing census work, every household is tagged, they are labeled, you know who they are, where they are. when we are calling it our national household assessment, and it will have pretty much updated administrative data or records on each household, because we are using some of the very same variables that you would do in a census. So we will have a better decision-making power in our hands, because then you could be able to see from the get-go if something is going to hit the northeastern side of the country. You pull it up on the map. You know where to target. You already know who to top up. You already know how many homes may have to evacuate. You already can preempt, okay, it will cause you to do anticipatory action work. This is what it's going to boil down to. But that is a proactive approach, right? So those are serious ways in which we can have a clear vision from the get-go by modernizing the whole system. If you notice, the DG first question was all about what is the system? Because it's not about a piece of a thing. It's not what policy you have and not what graduation strategy. They are all part of one system.
Thank you.
Okay, just to add to, before you ask your question, in St. Lucia, we still have persons who do not have access to machines or even an actual bank account. So we still do the somewhat archaic practice of getting our individuals to actually distribute actual money to them, you know, at particular depots and so on. But that we are working towards. And the whole thrust of social protection actually puts us face to face to persons who are in need of ID cards and even help with banking information and so on. So we're moving towards digitalization, but at the same time trying to encourage persons to, you know, get used to what is happening, doing it in a dignified way, because that is very, very intimidating. Yes.
Yeah.
There was a point earlier before we went into cash that I think was raised when they were talking. Somebody was talking about you know, having the capacity to to have access to data from different data sharing points and agencies. One caution. I know we said that, I know Bonnie was talking about, you know, what else beside the MOU. You know why it's critical to also be cautioned about this is that, because it's always a thin line to walk really, is that we have to look at the capacity of all the softwares that we are using. There's a difference between integration of data and interoperability. And that's the caution we have to always consider. Good example. Everybody in the room know about SmartStream. It's our financial software that is used in most of our territories. But it cannot be interoperable with SAMIS. So we had to create a strategy independent of the two systems to make the two systems start to speak to each other, right? And we then have to look at integrated measures instead, and then issued an MOU. So we could talk from now till tomorrow about data sharing policy around it, but that data sharing policy still boils down back to the last part being a SOP out of an MOU. How do we make it work for both entities? And that's why I would also want to caution us that as much as we're saying, oh, we could get this in health and we could get that, sometimes they can't speak. They weren't designed the same time. They were only designed for what this specific agency wanted and not considering other things. Just like the education point that I brought as a sample. Education, when they collected the data, the primary target were the students. So the student ID was the unique identifier. But in a SAMIS system, you need the parent. So even though the parent ID was a variable in their EMIS software, it was not compulsory. So you had some users having it and some don't. So we now have to create a pathway that enforces now the implementation of that unique identifier for the parent that is equally matched to the unique identifier in SAMIS, so that now we can then integrate or create the interoperability of the student ID. How can we track which child is getting universal access to things versus targeted access to programs? So that's a classic example of a lot of things sometimes you have to do independent of independent softwares to then force them to start talking. Thanks.
And all of this independent software thing she's talking about is added exponential costs because we've invested in one system, another system over there, and we have to bring it all together. And I'm going to wind up. You know, there's a Coleridge poem that says, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. Well, this is what we face, data, data everywhere, and not a drop to drink. And I can tell you some horror stories from the OECS Commission. You were talking about the unique ID system. Mm-hmm. Under the 10th EDF, we had something like about, $20 million to build a unique ID system. We had a company in the US to do that. They gave us a system. We collaborated with member states, had a system well defined. From the time you're born, you get an ID system till you die. And that tracks through. Provided each member state with printers, blank cards for this, it went nowhere in the end. And it went nowhere because of a political situation in one of the member states where the opposition started questioning the value of this thing and how it's going to be used for fraud and all of that stuff. And that killed the whole thing. We are still discussing the need for a unique ID, right? And the fact is, here is it happening in different spaces. So how many unique, the word unique means one. They don't have 2, 3 uniques that are unique. Right? So this is something we have to take very seriously. We also have, and I'm interested to know if any of you are aware of it, a project currently running with the World Bank and the OECS called the Data for Decision Making Project. And the purpose of that is to set up, to reconfigure data in all of the member states. So we're starting with setting up a data governance council of the OECS, which has just been set up, with representatives of all the member states, statutarizing your statistics departments so that these departments of statistics by law will be the compulsory repository of all data. And where the data is sensitive, they would have to, the sending agency would have to anonymize it, like income tax data and so on, anonymize it and pass it in. All of this would be held in what we call a data lake, interpolated with artificial intelligence, right? And the ability to do things across multiple layers. Now think of the potential of that use of data, because there are things, especially with the use of AI in that, what you can do is incredible. We know practically that, yes, children's learning ability is affected by nutritional status. But imagine that database where you have education data, exams performance, you have household income, you have family education, you have nutritional status, health status, everything. To get an AI engine to crawl that and see what is the exact correlation between nutritional status, as in calorific intake on a daily basis, and children's learning and performance. You remember the point I made earlier today about targeted interventions? Incredible possibilities for that. Yeah. One last question.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank all the 3 panelists for this very informative bit of information. Just my main question is to the PS from St. Lucia. In Grenada, we have the recertification program. That is a program where we can gather some of the beneficiaries from the SEED program. You had spoken a bit about your graduation of the 3.0. Is there a possibility of having us have a share on how you run that particular program and how we can benefit in best practices that can help build that system a bit. We also know that there is a kind of lag in terms of sharing with education and health and the whole system coming into being. How can you advise us here in Grenada now as to how your graduation system is successful and what can I integrate or migrate from St. Lucia to help Grenada in that respect? That is one. The other thing I want to say to all the panelists, I recalled recently in Grenada one of the top credit union being hacked for weeks, about 2 weeks. And no one could not have withdrawn, either deposit money. As a OECS, what are the contingency plan in place in case of these disasters that could impact the life? The same vulnerable that we are trying to prevent social crisis. In the event that we have already digitalized and put our systems in place, what are the contingency plan when these things do occur? Not if, but when they do occur. Thank you.
So I'll allow the panelists to answer, but I'll preempt their answers. The answer to everything is yes. First of all, in terms of the St. Lucia's availability, I will take the presumption of saying yes to her. And I'm saying that because one of the things we've been looking at in the OECS is the idea of having some positions at the commission that are permanent positions, but not occupying them permanently, so that we can use it for rotation of skills. You see these ladies here? One of them could come to the OECS for 6 months to help you do what you want to do. And when that is over, we take somebody else from another member state. Different expertise solve different problems. And in that way, we get things done. Right? Yeah.
Okay, I smiled largely because as it relates to our SLNet 3.0, Mr. St. Catherine is right in the room. He's the mastermind and the engineer, and he was our guiding angel where that is concerned. So before you leave, make sure you introduce yourself to Mr. St. Catherine, okay? And secondly, as it relates to exchanging and sharing information, this is where our SIS, the Social Information Network, comes in, and the World Bank HCRP, Human Capital Resilient Project, is actually carrying us with this. So before we leave, or even while we're home, we can share that kind of information, okay? And I think the Commission has put in place ways and means for us to contact each other. So we just go to separate islands, but it's one Caribbean.
And we are setting up virtual working groups, because now with offline, online stuff, it's easy. WhatsApp groups, virtual groups, email groups. So the sharing of that information is easy. And more importantly, using WhatsApp, you can be asking questions instantaneously and get responses, even while you're in a meeting and you have a query. Any final words, ladies?
Just to answer the second part of the question with regards to the hacks and so on. So what is built into our SAMIS software entire operation, the strategy, is that we have a separate backup, and that is not, it has nothing to do with our information technology service division infrastructure. That's separate under our National Archives and Documentation Center. So there is a separate procurement of equipment, etc., that was done independently, so that it has the backup naturally built in, so that if there is an outage, there is something that has happened, then there is that separate route that is provided as an opportunity for retrieval of data. So that was one way. We know that our aim is not to eliminate, because that is humanly impossible. Our aim is to minimize as much as possible and to keep some of the things that are outside of our control at a minimum. So there is no perfect system, but in the end, you must constantly deal with risk mitigation measures to try to reduce the propensity for increased risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG. Thank you to our panelists. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Of course, I have to be the timekeeper. We're pressed for time. But I'm told that one of the asks is, if well, I certainly enjoyed this session. I thought it was very valuable. But is this a part of the meeting that we as ministers of the council would like to keep The OECS wants to know if this is something that we want to continue scheduling in terms of having the armchair discussions with our senior technocrats and as a form of knowledge exchange. Is that something that we want to keep? Yes. Okay, so yes. All right, so thank you very much. Round of applause to all of you. Thank you, DG, for moderating. Now we have 3 minutes to shuffle over to the next room to continue the meeting, and we will hear from Mr. St. Catherine about the poverty assessment.